Welcome back to the Foreign Desk podcast. I'm Lisa Daftari. So much happening in just over a week. We had world leaders gathering in Vienna to get back into the 2015 JCPOA. Over the weekend, Iran's main enrichment facility at Natanz was hit by a cyber attack. Of course, the Islamic Republic pointing fingers at Israel, but we don't have any confirmation of that yet. But what do they do in response? The Iranian government says, now that this happened, we are going to enrich uranium to 60%. Well, they've made the threat before, but now they are doubling down and saying, we're not backing down anytime soon. So what does the U.S. do? Well, we're meeting with them again in Vienna. As a matter of fact, new talks begin today, or I should say they resume today. And to make sense of all of this, because it doesn't make much sense to the average person, we will call upon Gabriel Noronha. He is the former State Department Special Advisor to Iran. And before that, I should say while he was doing that, he coordinated policy and directed the State Department's communication and congressional affairs for Iran under President Trump. And he previously worked as Special Assistant for the Senate Armed Service Committee, and currently he is Executive Director for two new foreign policy initiatives based in Washington, speaks 4 languages, and of course, Spanish, Russian, Mandarin, and English, 2 very, very important languages for what we're dealing with in foreign policy. So no wonder you are such a foreign policy star, Gabriel. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for having me.
It's interesting for you, especially. I know I've been covering this for years and have been following the foreign policy trajectory coming out of the White House with regards to Iran and how vastly it has differed, especially with the last 3 presidents going from, appeasement back to, let's isolate and punish and put pressure on Iran, back to appease them. But things are very different right now. Obviously, things have moved quite a bit with regards to the Iranian regime. The realities on the ground, it doesn't look too good. So, how does it look from your seat? Let's start there.
So it's interesting what you said about how it sort of changed so much from 3 presidents. Before the JCPOA, Iran policy was actually fairly bipartisan. There was this unified agreement that we had to deal with Iran's malign behavior and treat them as an enemy. And the JCPOA changed that with large elements of the Democratic Party being really wedded to the JCPOA and almost viewing it with almost religious fanaticism of having to protect it at all costs. Now we've done 3 years of maximum pressure. It took a long time to actually get to full steam. And when that happened, Iran's economy and their political structure were incredibly weakened. Over this week, we saw that Iran's foreign currency exchange reserves plummeted from over 120 million down to just billion to just 4 billion. Their military spending plummeted by 28% one year and then 25% this year, really in dire straits. And it's President Biden who has now sort of halted maximum pressure. And it's really given the regime a lifeline that they needed. It looks like their economic growth is coming back. And that's not a good negotiation position to have. If you're going to be trying to get a deal, you want them to be the desperate ones. Instead, unfortunately, it seems that it's the United States who are the ones who are so desperate for a deal. We're the ones talking about it. Biden and Blinken and Rob Malley are the ones all the time talking about what can we do to get Iran to the table, when it should be the other way around. We're not hurting. We're not, our economy is doing fine. We're not under imminent military threat. So it should be Iran who is begging to come to the table, not us.
Right. And why? I mean, it makes no sense to any average person. Like you said, it was bipartisan because it's a common enemy. You can look at what they're doing, whether it's the human rights abuses, whether it's the exporting of terror in the region, whether it's obviously all the numbers with regards to their nuclear programs. This is not a peaceful program. This is not, an educational infrastructural program. Why? It's every guest I have on here, I always want to get an answer. Why were, Biden, Harris, Blinken, Malley, these are all somewhat, seasoned politicians, statesmen, they understand diplomacy. They understand a basic deal. They understand when, from kindergarten, when you're out in the playground, I'll give you this toy if you give me that one. It has to be a fair deal. And this doesn't sound like anything like a fair deal. And as you said, we're in a position where there's a ripe opportunity where Iran has been has come to a place where they are vulnerable, where we can exert more pressure in order to get the outcome that we want. Why all this gymnastics to push forward with a deal that makes no sense?
It's a great question. I think there's two reasons. One, they ran for 4 years on sort of this everything Trump does is bad and we have to reverse it. And so there's a large element within the administration which sort of says we condemn Trump for leaving the deal, and therefore as sort of a campaign promise, we have to go back into it, even though it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Now you have other elements within the administration. You have National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who seems to be, and some of his staff, who seem to be actually a lot more wary of it. And they don't actually think it's a great deal, but they seem to be getting completely overridden by Secretary Blinken and Rob Malley in the interagency discussions and debates, which is really quite unfortunate. Because like you said, there are some smart people, seasoned people, but they're getting outmaneuvered by really sort of the progressive wing of the left, who is dead set. And this is sort of how I explain it. It's not so much about the negotiation that they love the JCPOA. It's really, in their view, an attempt to reshape the Middle East. And they don't actually think we should be treating Israel and Saudi Arabia and UAE like allies and partners. They think that we should be balancing everyone against each other. And that way we are more close with Iran or we're equally as close with Iran as we are with Saudi Arabia. And that's the mistake Obama made back in 2014, 2015, trying to play the two against each other when it's ridiculous. Saudi Arabia and Iran are worlds apart. Saudi Arabia is not killing Americans and threatening death to Israel and death to America every week. Iran is, and we really need to treat it differently. And so the problem is that Biden has this very warped, or his advisors at least, have this very warped idea of how we can restructure the Middle East. It's their grand strategy. And that, I think, is at the real core of why they're trying to get back into the JCPOA.
Yeah, speaking of reshaping the Middle East, because you mentioned it, a lot was done under President Trump's 4 years in actually reshaping the Middle East, more than had been done in decades. The Abraham Accords, of course, the realignment with our ally Israel, moving the embassy, doubling down on the Golan Heights and confirming that, and really just reshaping the Middle East in a way that's not just good for us and our allies in the West, but good for the Middle East and its future.
Absolutely.
And the people there. And to that end, the people in Iran are probably looking around and saying, we want a piece of that. We want that too. We want the apps. We want the technology. We want to move forward with everybody else. We don't want to be stuck in the dark ages because of our government. We had, of course, Victoria Coates and Len Khodorovsky on this show talking about the Cyrus Accords, which would be kind of like a parallel to the Abraham Accords, bringing Iran into the fold with Israel, of course. I mean, that's light years away with regards to, if you compare it to the way that we're headed with our current administration. But my question to you is, the reality on the ground has changed significantly. So whether it's Blinken or Biden or Kamala Harris, who comes into the White House wanting to go back to an Obama era, it didn't make sense then, but it makes less sense now. What kind of pushback will they receive? What will it look like? And what are the new challenges in the new Middle East that they're facing now?
That's a great question. I'll give a couple facts that might sort of explain to the audience just how things are different. If you look at Iran these days, mosque attendance is at about 20%. It's actually one of the most secular nations in the Middle East, even though it's sort of this theocratic Islamic republic. The youth these days are incredibly disenchanted with the rule of the mullahs. And a lot of the people in power are folks who, did the revolution 42 years ago. These guys are in their 70s, 80s, sometimes in their 90s. These are the folks who are running things. And so all the time now we're seeing stories of ayatollahs who are in charge of things dying off. and you have a lot of the leaders of the IRGC who all were the generals in the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s. That was the days when, the population, there was a little bit more, they had just sort of participated in the revolution, some of them. There was a little bit more buy-in. It's completely different now. The youth today hate the IRGC, they hate the mullahs, they don't even care much about Shia Islam. And so if you're trying to do a deal which is accommodating this regime, you're not doing something that the people actually want. You're actually doing something in diametric opposition to the wishes of the people in Iran.
Right. And people have said that. We've been trying to bring attention to that for many years, actually having the voices of the people in Iran, what they want, why they go out onto the streets. And speaking of going out onto the streets, I know you tweeted heavily about this. We tried to bring a lot of attention at the Foreign Desk as well on, and I want to jog people's memories. We've had years of protests, and these are real freedom fighter protests, mostly peaceful protests, with Iranians coming out onto the streets for various reasons and various catalysts that bring them out onto the streets. But the bottom line for all of them is that we're done with this regime. It doesn't serve us. They're serving the people of Syria and the Palestinians, and they're serving Hamas and Hezbollah, but they're not serving us. We're tired of the executions. We're tired of the human rights abuses. That's what the people on the street are saying. And these fire squads come out and just shoot at them. I mean, the last round of protests we had in 2019, they just came out shooting at these protesters. And some reports said 300, 400. Reuters came out and said 1,500. Now, 1,500 for people who are actually following what's going on the ground was also a very low estimate, because people in Iran are telling me 3,000, 4,000. Now, last week, the State Department removed this number, 1,500, that this even happened, basically rewriting history. Now, what's going on here?
It's incredibly sad. It's incredibly disappointing. So I was the lead at the State Department for human rights on Iran, and helped write that report, which documented how it was 1,500. So let's sort of level set. It's difficult to know every single person killed in Iran, because the police and the IRGC hide it up, and they threaten families, and they say, if you talk to the press, we'll put you in prison. But there's one group of people that know exactly how many Iranians were killed, and it's the Iranian government. They keep immaculate statistics. They are in touch with the morgues. They know everything. It's the government. And so the best way to actually tell how many were killed is you ask officials in the government, and that's what Reuters did. And it was either 2 or 3 officials who were fairly senior, and I know the reporter who did this reporting, and their methodology is excellent. That report came in and they said it was 1,500 Iranians killed, and that's sort of at least. I've seen the reports that it could be 3,000. It could be. I don't know. I'm not the one to be able to decide this. The Iranian officials are the ones to decide it, and they've told us it's 1,500. So why did the U.S. say it was 300? It's really disappointing and appalling that they would sort of lowball that estimate. They also, from my experience, aren't trying to find the truth. They're not looking to find inconvenient statistics about the Iranian regime. They're not looking to make arrests or interdictions of Iranian weapon sales right now, because it's an inconvenient report that will get in the way of their negotiations in Vienna right now. They're really wholeheartedly trying to get back in the JCPOA, and unfortunately, they're willing to look past Iranian terrorism, cyber attacks, human rights violations, if that's what's necessary to get back in the deal. And that's really disappointing.
What were some of the things that you saw in doing these reports on human rights in Iran? And would you summarize, would you conclude that we should leave human rights out of the equation when dealing with Iran?
We can't. We really can't. So the thing that hurt me the most was there was this report in the November protests about the city of Marshar, which is in the southwest in Khuzestan, I believe. And there were a bunch of protesters who had fled the IRGC and they hid in these marshes. And we have video of what happens next, where the IRGC pulls up in pickup trucks and they just start spraying the marsh with machine gun fire. And then they light the marsh on fire and tried to burn protesters alive and get them to flee so they could shoot them. Just disgusting, disgusting things that really have stayed with me. So here's what we should have as a standard. If you want business to come back into Iran, if you want Boeing or any of these companies to do business in Iran, it has to be with an Iran that respects its own people and where that business is actually going to be helping the Iranian people live dignified, free lives. And so in my world, if I were the negotiator, I would say, if you want economic development, you want economic incentives, that has to be conditioned on you treating your people fairly and according to the rule of law, like any other country would.
Right. Right.
And we can't just leave it out of the picture and leave the Iranian people, to suffer just because we don't want Iran to enrich uranium at a certain percentage and leave the Iranian people to suffer as a result. It's the wrong decision, and it would be disastrous, unfortunately, to them.
Meanwhile, White House spokesperson had this to say about getting back into talks with Iran. I want to get your reaction on the other side. Take a listen.
Well, I would just reiterate that we don't have any additional speculation to add to the cause or the origin of the attacks over the weekend. What our focus is on the diplomatic path forward. And we believe in the diplomatic conversations, though they will be indirect, will reconvene tomorrow in Vienna. We know this will be a long process, but we certainly see that as a positive sign. Our understanding is they plan to attend tomorrow. We are also very open-eyed about how this will be a long process. It's happening through indirect discussions, but we still feel that it is a step forward.
I mean, she keeps repeating forward. That's all they're focused on. And we acknowledge it's going to be a long path forward. I mean, you say that, like you said in the beginning of the show, that when you want to convince someone of something, when you want to bring them in and you don't have the upper hand, you say it's going to be a long process, but we'll get there, right? I mean, what's your reaction to all of this?
So first, my impression is they'll stay at the negotiating table as long as it takes for them to capitulate to Iran is what I think. And the longer that Iran holds out, the more the United States is willing to give up in the negotiations, which is problematic. Here's another thing that's wrong with the negotiations. Who's there? It's not anyone that's actually affected by the day-to-day activities of the Islamic Republic. Israel's not there, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain. None of the countries that are actually impacted by Iran getting a nuclear weapon or Iran furthering their terrorist activity get a seat at the table. They don't get a say. It's very similar to Europe in the 19th century carving up Africa and saying, "Oh, guess you guys aren't here at the table. You'll just have to live with whatever decisions we make for you guys, and then we want you to accept those results." It's deeply insulting to the rest of the Middle East that Europe and Russia and China are the ones who are talking to Iran. We're not even in the room with Iran, and we're accepting the Europeans and Russians and Chinese ferrying the messages between us. It's just set up very wrong to begin with.
Right. And it doesn't look good when you have last week a GOP-led letter that basically put Biden on notice and said, Congress isn't going to be bound by any deal that you guys can go out and you can do all your negotiations, but when you come home, don't expect us to accept this. I mean, that looks awful, doesn't it, on the world stage?
It does. And look, if Biden wanted something that could get Americans to agree to it, it's easy. There's a whole process. It's called a treaty. And you get a deal and you submit it to the Senate as a treaty. And if 2/3 of the Senate approves of it, then it becomes binding and sort of effectively U.S. law. And that's the route that President Trump and Brian Hook and Elliot Abrams and Secretary Pompeo promised to the American people. They said, if we're going to make it a deal, it'll be strong enough that we'll allow the people to vote on it. And that's what Biden should do. Instead, what he's trying to do, the sort of secret path he's doing, is he's trying to circumvent any vote in Congress at all by pretending that he's going back to the same deal that you had in 2015, even though that deal's completely gone. It's dead. And so if I were the Iranians, what I would say is, hey, if I make one of these weak deals with the United States, yeah, they are going to rip it up in 3 years if there's a Republican in office. And so I'd be a lot more wary of making any deal with the United States because you have Republicans saying, look, we won't honor it. So if I'm Iran, I would say, okay, you want a deal? Bring it to the Senate too. We want Congress to have a vote in this if they're the ones who are going to rip it up in 3 years.
It's not just Republicans, though, right? As you said, there are people inside, whether it's Jake Sullivan or, I know there are Democrat senators who are as vocal as they can be.
Yeah.
Are they being heard?
Probably not much. It's important to remember 3 of the most powerful Democrat senators voted against the JCPOA. Robert Menendez, who's the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Chuck Schumer, who's now the majority leader. They both voted against it and said it was a horrible deal. And so they're still now the 2 most important senators, and they're going to have a lot of opposition. What I think they're doing is they're probably making their voice heard, but very quietly and privately. Sort of like what Israel was doing until about last week. They were trying to do this in private. They weren't trying to sort of attack Biden right out of the gate. But once they saw where this negotiation was leading, Israel started becoming a lot more public and saying, we're not having this. This is not going in a good direction. And I think you're going to start seeing a lot more Democrats come out too and say, this doesn't make any sense. This is worse. This isn't just the JCPOA. This is worse because we're 6 years closer to everything expiring. And that's why I think you're going to see a lot of people in Congress, Republicans and Democrats, opposing what the Biden administration is looking at doing.
For the average person, can you walk us through the hierarchy here? Let's say somebody like yourself who's an advisor in the State Department. How influential is a voice like in your position? Or, how influential can Congress or Senate be down the line? Can you walk us through who can put a stop to this? Who can make their voices heard? Or, is this just going to be pushed through, fast and furious as we expect it to be?
So one thing I learned when I was a staffer is you can affect the details and you can provide good recommendations. At the end of the day, the buck stops with the president. Now, the Secretary of State has a lot of input, and they're going to be telling the president you can do option A or option B, and the president will pick from there. The staff are largely there to sort of execute and inform and help guide those decisions. The people making the decisions, it's going to be Rob Malley, it's going to be Blinken, and ultimately President Biden. What can Congress do? Congress can do 2 things. One, they can send a very strong signal to the White House that any deal that doesn't have their approval isn't going to cut it, and it won't last more than 2 years or 4 years, and then they'll rip it up. And the thing is, the Iranians actually pay attention to what people in Congress say. They don't often talk about it a lot, but they're always listening. And so what members of Congress and the Senate say, it goes a long way. And so the other thing that they can do is they can pass legislation that says Biden isn't allowed to make this agreement at all without getting their approval first. So there's a lot of things that people can do. And it's really important that people listening, if you want to contact your Congress member or senator and say, hey, I strongly oppose these negotiations. It's going to be bad for the Middle East, for my family back in the Middle East, if you have any. Members of Congress will listen to that, and it's important that you talk to them.
Answer this question for us, because I get this question a lot, and it's a valid question. People wonder what's so bad about Iran getting a nuclear weapon. A lot of countries have it. A lot of maybe questionable countries have it. Why can't Iran have one?
It's a good question. I think there's a lot of reasons. Most importantly, Iran has attacked and conducted terrorist attacks on more than 40 nations over the last 40 years. And they don't care. They've attacked Belgium, they've attacked Japan, they've attacked Australians, Americans. So they don't really care who you are. As long as you are in their way of their agenda, they have no problem attacking you. The next thing is look at how they threaten the world without nuclear weapons. They'll kidnap journalists, they'll kidnap hostages, they'll take tankers, and that's just to get a couple $1 million as hostage, as sort of the payment for the hostages. Imagine if they had a nuclear weapon, what they would hold the world hostage to. They would they threaten to destroy Israel, and they might actually go out and do that. But they would just blackmail the United States and Europe and Middle East for anything and everything they wanted. And they'd say, if you don't do this, cool, we're willing to threaten you with our nuclear weapons and our nuclear arsenal. It would completely change the Middle East too. You'd start to see a nuclear arms race, which is probably pretty close to being started right now, with all the other countries in the Middle East who would be threatened by Iran and say, we want a nuclear weapon too. And if you look at the last 60 years in world history, it's this, there's been so much effort by the world powers to stop the increase of nuclear weapons growth throughout the world. And if you allow the JCPOA to come back in, what you're going to see another 3, 4, 5 countries start getting nuclear weapons. It's very dangerous.
What's dangerous about not getting back into a deal on the flip side?
So I think there's some danger of having a real rift with some of our allies in Europe. It's a good thing if we can be on the same side as the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. And unfortunately, they've picked the wrong direction, in my view. They want to get back to the deal. One good thing about the negotiation, this is maybe the only good thing about the negotiations happening right now, is the Iranians are being so unreasonable that the Europeans are getting pretty fed up with them. Right. And they're sort of saying, okay, we've even offered to go back in the deal, which is a sweetheart deal for you. If you turn down that offer, what are we going to do? And so it's possible that they would initiate the so-called snapback sanctions, and that they would reimpose sanctions against Iran. That would be a good step. And so I think it is important that we get on the same page with them. Russians and Chinese, they're hopeless. They will always have Iran's back no matter what. And we shouldn't be calling them partners, which is what Secretary Blinken and Rob Malley are calling them these days.
Yeah, they should not be at that table because obviously they don't have the same intentions as we do.
They also don't have anything to offer Iran. They don't have sanctions to withdraw. There's really no point in them being there at all, except they're going to have Iran's back.
To push forward, right. And speaking of China, this is another area of your expertise. I wanted to get your thoughts on the 25-year deal that was announced between China and Iran just a couple weeks ago. This was many years many months in the making and announced now. The Iranian regime seems to be so tactful about their timing of announcements and propaganda, and it's no coincidence that they decided to flex their muscles once again and say, well, we don't need any of you to buy our oil. We have the best partner. We've got the Chinese people, 400 billion over 25 years. What's the significance, short-term and long-term, about this deal?
First, you mentioned the word propaganda. I think propaganda is a really good word for what this deal is. A little historical context. China routinely makes these big sweeping announcements with other countries, even from Russia to all these third world countries in Africa. And they promise all this investment. And then they don't actually do a whole lot of it. It's exaggerated, and it's made to make China look powerful and make the other countries look like they're about to get a bunch of investment, so that they're usually corrupt leaders get more public approval. Mm-hmm. I don't think this sort of $400 billion figure is at all possible. Based on previous trends, Iran's economy just isn't big enough to do that. Here's the other thing. You can look at, say, Iran and its trade with Venezuela. Venezuela is halfway across the world. Why is it trading with Venezuela? The answer is because no one else will. all the other countries have completely isolated Iran. They don't want to have anything to do with it. China is another example. Even though, by all normal reasons, Iran should hate China. China is locking up 1 million Uyghurs, many of whom are Muslim, in concentration camps. And Ali Khamenei pretends that he's sort of this protector of the Muslim people throughout the world.
Right.
He should be condemning China for putting Muslims in concentration camps. Instead, they're sort of begging at China's feet that, oh, please do some economic deals with us. It's insulting it's probably difficult for Khamenei to even do it himself because it's so almost emasculating. And so I think we should not view too much into this China-Iran deal. And what they want us to say, oh no, they're getting into this great deal. The best thing we can do is go back in the JCPOA and mend fences, and it'll draw China and Iran further away from each other. That's not going to happen. The best thing we can do is keep the pressure on, sanction Chinese companies and oil companies especially who are doing business with Iran. Under Secretary Pompeo, we sanctioned a huge number of Chinese companies who are doing business with Iran. Unfortunately, Secretary Blinken hasn't made any economic sanctions at all since he's taken office.
Do you think they understand the threat of curbing China overall, I should say, as its own, foreign policy issue, not related to Iran? Do they understand that threat?
Some people do, but I don't think they're willing to take the strong enough measures to really do that. And this sort of depends who you look at within the government. There are some people who are doing excellent work. One thing that I've noticed is they're really not they're not viewing the genocide of the Uyghur people with enough seriousness. The Biden administration sort of hemmed and hawed for a few weeks about whether they even wanted to call it a genocide. And I think this is really a problem with American society and progressives. If you look back 12, 15 years ago, it was actually usually liberals who were talking about Tibet and free Tibet and how we need to stand up for the people of Tibet. Unfortunately, the left and progressives are almost silent now about the plight of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And it's really unfortunate and disturbing to me that they haven't said and done more. I think you see a lot of Republicans being the ones who are talking about it the most and saying, hey, we need to have sort of an economic boycott of anything that is contributing to this genocide going on right now.
Yeah, we always say that. We say that it's the conservatives who are talking about the women in Iran, or about even the gays in Iran, or all the young journalists in Iran being rounded up. You're not hearing anyone on the left. They're just pushing for a deal that appeasement is going to make everything magically go away. In your opinion, this is a big question, so you can take your time with it. What's the best case and worst case scenario that can come out of Vienna?
The best case is there is no deal. And I actually think this is probably the most likely scenario. Is a lot of people are talking about a deal. I actually think the two sides are a lot further away from making a deal than most people realize.
Wait, I want to ask you, do you think it's because Iran has overplayed its hand?
That's part of it. They also are, the hardliners didn't even like the JCPOA to begin with, and they want to stop from getting into the JCPOA right now. I think they are being greedy. I think they are sort of overplaying their hand. But I think there's also a lot of folks, and maybe this is why they're overplaying their hand, who actually don't want a deal to begin with. Folks like Zarif absolutely want it, and a lot of your sort of.
Do you actually believe that, Gabriel, or do you think? And I think it looks more like a good cop, bad cop situation where, some of them are saying, oh, no, we don't even want it. Don't even, I know there was a headline where they said, we're not even going to look at the offers that were put on the table in Vienna last week.
Oh, there's definitely the good cop, bad cop routine is always happening. But it's also interesting when you sort of read Iranian newspapers of what they're saying when they don't think the West is listening. They actually kind of are attacking their own negotiators too. So it's not, in my view, quite as clear cut as we think it is. Now you talked about the worst. So the best case scenario is they just sort of say, yeah, actually, we don't want this deal. Or the United States realizes this doesn't make any sense, and they listen to people in Congress and they say, okay, this doesn't work for us. The worst case scenario is you go back in the JCPOA. And what Iran is asking right now is they want the United States to end all the sanctions since 2015, end those immediately, and then Iran will consider ending its nuclear sort of extortion racket that it's been doing. That would be the truly worst scenario if the U.S. is gullible enough to fall for that.
Yeah, if they blink first, right?
Yeah, and which outcome will happen? I'm not certain. I think this is going to take some time. I don't think the final outcome will be clear until probably later this summer, if there is one at all. I could be wrong, but I think it's going to take quite some time. And I hope that's true, because the longer that it takes, the more opportunity there is for the United States to wake up and say, this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, or at least maybe our European counterparts can knock some sense into us if we're not the ones to see reality.
In 2014 and 2015, the French, if you can believe this, were actually the ones saying to John Kerry, saying, come on, you're not even negotiating hard enough. It was the French who were pushing for a stronger deal. And Kerry was the one that said, oh, no, we can't be that mean to Iran. We have to give them exactly what they want.
Right. I mean, I still have to dig to the bottom of this as to why these people are so, so enthusiastic about appeasing, terrorists who have blood on their hands, who have, they have not one honest bone in their body when they come to the negotiating table. And their bottom line is not diplomacy, that's for sure. But thank you so much, Gabriel. Why don't you tell us what you're working on, if you can? What we could watch, where to look for you, and how to follow your work.
So I am leading 2 new foreign policy organizations. They haven't been announced quite yet, so you'll hear more from me in the coming weeks. My big work I'm working on right now is trying to get Congress to really stand up and say that they will and must demand a vote on any agreement that Biden gets. Right now, Biden is trying to do this thing, and some Democrat senators are with him to bypass Congress altogether. And they don't want to have to take a hard vote on the bad deal that they get. And so I'm spending a lot of my time working to make sure that doesn't happen.
Okay, we will definitely follow that. We'll report on it at the Foreign Desk, and of course, tweet out anything that is newsworthy coming out. And we've been putting your Twitter handle on the screen so people know where to find you. Thank you so much for your service. Thank you so much for your wonderful, wonderful work, and for coming on our show. And
thank you very much for having me on, Lisa.
Go follow him. He's a smart guy. And to the rest of you who'd like to sign up for our weekly top 10 email, go to foreigndesknews.com. And to sign up for our weekly podcast, you can go to youtube.com/Lisa Daftari, and we will see you all next week. But before I forget, on Monday night, we will have another foreign policy power panel. We have a wonderful lineup of guests with Bijan Kian and Michael Rubin from AEI, and of course, Shiwei Wang, who was the hostage who was held in Iran for over 3 years. They will discuss the Iran deal, the China-Iran deal that was struck for 25 years, and we will talk about the future of Middle East foreign policy. Please tune in Monday night, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. We hope to see you then. Bye-bye.